The baby started crying before the seatbelt light dimmed. Reed Langston looked up from his tablet, irritated, not because of the noise, but because he couldn't focus. The sound was raw, desperate, human. It cut through the steady hum of the jet engines like truth through static. He wasn't used to that anymore. His world ran on precision, on control, on silence. But then something changed. The woman holding the child leaned close, whispering, not in English, but in a lilting, musical Spanish. The boy quieted slightly, hiccuping between sobs. When he stirred again, she switched seamlessly to French, then to Mandarin, her tone soft as rain. Each shift in language soothed him further until, by the time the flight attendant passed by, he was asleep against her chest. Reed blinked. He'd never seen fluency used like that, not as intellect, but as instinct. For a man who built empires through the precision of words, it was strangely humbling. She didn't look like someone who spoke 7 languages. Her clothes were plain, a gray cardigan, jeans, a pair of scuffed sneakers. Her hair was tied in a loose braid that had begun to unravel. Yet her face, focused, patient, alive, held the kind of quiet competence Reed's boardroom never did. He tried to return to his work. The contract on his screen was a minefield of translation inconsistencies. A French clause misaligned with its English equivalent, a Chinese annotation that changed the meaning entirely. Somewhere in those tangled sentences was a billion-dollar problem waiting to explode. He muttered under his breath, "How does anyone confuse non-lethal with non-critical?" To his surprise, a soft voice answered, "They probably used tolerable instead of anodin." Reed turned. The woman was looking directly at him. Her eyes, clear hazel, ringed with exhaustion, held no hesitation. "Excuse me?" he asked. "In French," she said, as if explaining something to a child. "Non-lethal doesn't mean harmless. It means survivable. There's a moral difference, not just a linguistic one." Reed blinked. "You're a translator?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." That answer only deepened his curiosity. They didn't speak again until dinner service, when the flight attendant accidentally handed her his meal and vice versa. Reed reached for the tray, but she smiled apologetically. "Maybe it's a sign," she said lightly. "Of what?" "That the universe wants you to eat the vegetarian option." He smirked despite himself. "The universe clearly hasn't read my schedule." She chuckled, then fed her son small spoonfuls of applesauce. Her hands were steady, practiced, like someone who'd learned patience the hard way. When the boy fell asleep again, Reed found himself asking, "You mentioned you're not a translator anymore. What are you now?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "A mother, mostly. Sometimes a freelancer when bills don't care about that title." Her honesty caught him off guard. He'd built his life on polished evasions, on half-truths, with edges sanded smooth. She spoke with none of that artifice. He leaned forward slightly. "You speak French, Spanish, Mandarin? What else?" She ticked off fingers absent-mindedly. "Arabic, Russian, Italian, English." "That's 7. "Depends who's counting," she said. "I never learned the language of rich men who make offers they don't mean." Reed laughed, startled. "You think that's a language?" "Of course," she said, meeting his eyes. "You just don't call it one." The flight attendants dimmed the cabin lights. The ocean beneath them stretched infinite and black. Reed should have been asleep, but something about the conversation gnawed at him. He wasn't sure whether it was her tone, steady but fearless, or the fact that she dared to challenge him at all. Most people didn't, not when they recognized him. "Reed Langston," she said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. "Langston Biotech. You're on the news sometimes." He raised a brow. "Sometimes? I don't watch the kind of news that makes billionaires look like heroes," she said. He couldn't help smiling. "And yet, here we are, sharing dinner." Her lips quirked. "Don't mistake politeness for admiration." Reed should have been annoyed. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar, disarmed. As dawn began to stain the horizon, he noticed the boy shivering under a thin blanket. Without thinking, Reed stood and fetched his own from the overhead compartment. When he handed it over, she hesitated. "You don't have to." "I know," he said, "but I want to." She accepted it quietly. her fingers brushing his. For a moment, neither spoke. Then in a voice so low it barely carried over the engine noise, she said, "Thank you." Reed nodded, sitting back down. But his mind wasn't on his contracts anymore. He'd spent his life chasing efficiency, languages reduced to tools, words bent into currency. Yet this woman, who had nothing to her name but her voice, had wielded language like grace. And for the first time in years, he realized he wasn't just listening, he was hearing. By the time the plane touched down in Boston, she was gone before he could say goodbye. Her seat was empty, her child's blanket folded neatly on the tray table. But in its place, she'd left something behind, a slip of paper tucked into the magazine pouch. It was one of his own printed pages, the French contract clause she'd corrected mid-flight. In neat handwriting beneath it, she'd written, "Words save lives when you let them." He stared at it, a slow smile forming. By the time he reached the terminal, Reed Langston knew two things. He wasn't letting this woman vanish again, and for the first time in his life, the next meeting he'd chase wouldn't be for business. Reed Langston didn't believe in coincidences until that morning. The snow had barely begun to fall over Boston when his assistant burst into the conference room, apologizing for interrupting a meeting that could determine a billion-dollar partnership. She carried a tablet, breathless. "Sir, we've got a situation with the Zurich contract," she said. "The French translation you approved doesn't match the English draft. Legal says it invalidates the entire deal." Reed's blood ran cold. He'd personally reviewed that translation on the flight, right before she had pointed out the error. He took the tablet. The mistake was glaring now that he knew what to look for. She had been right, exactly right. If he hadn't caught it, the company could have faced months of litigation, maybe worse. He looked out the window, where flakes of snow drifted past the skyline. The city was waking up, and somewhere in it was the woman who'd saved his company without knowing it. He didn't even know her name. Reed wasn't the type to chase strangers, but that morning he broke every rule he'd ever written for himself. Within hours, he'd tasked his executive assistant with finding her. Passenger records, manifest logs. He had connections in every airport system from London to Zurich. Being a billionaire meant access came faster than conscience. Still, something about this search felt different. It wasn't business. It was something older, quieter, something that hummed beneath the noise of strategy and numbers. By late afternoon, his phone buzzed. "We found her," his assistant said. Her name was Camille Doyle, 25, U.S. citizen, single mother, recent address, South Boston. No criminal record, no social media footprint, but one line in her employment history made Reed pause. Former research assistant, Cambridge Institute of Linguistics. He remembered how she'd spoken on that flight, confident, precise, with the kind of intellectual fluency that came from more than textbooks. He closed his laptop and stood. "Schedule a meeting with her," he said. His assistant hesitated. "What should I tell her it's about?" Reed smiled faintly. "Tell her it's about a job, something permanent." Camille almost didn't show up. She sat outside the Langston Biotech headquarters for nearly 10 minutes, watching people in expensive coats sweep past revolving doors. The building itself looked like money, steel and glass, towering and indifferent. Noah, her son, tugged her sleeve from his stroller. "Mommy, cold." She knelt beside him, tucking the blanket tighter. "Just a minute, sweetheart. Mommy's thinking." Truth was, she hadn't planned on taking any meetings this week. Between her translation gig drying up and daycare costs rising again, she was barely managing. So when a corporate recruiter had called about an urgent consulting opportunity, she'd almost hung up until she heard the name Langston. Reed Langston. She still remembered his calm voice on the plane, the way he'd looked at her like she wasn't invisible. But billionaires didn't remember women like her. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the glass door. The receptionist recognized her immediately. "Ms. Doyle? Mr. Langston's expecting you." That sentence alone felt like a paradox. When the elevator doors opened to the top floor, she stepped into an office so minimalist it felt like a museum. Snowlight poured across dark wood, and there he was, leaning against the window, sleeves rolled to his elbows, studying her as if the city beyond him didn't exist. "Camille," he said, and her name sounded different when he spoke it. "I'm glad you came." "I wasn't sure I should," she admitted. He smiled faintly. "Neither was I. But then I remembered you corrected $1 million mistake at 30,000 feet, so I decided to take the risk." She blinked. "You mean the translation thing?" "I mean the translation thing that could have cost us half our international partners," he said. "You saved me from a disaster, Ms. Doyle, and I don't like owing debts." Camille frowned. "You don't owe me anything." "That's where you're wrong." He gestured to the table where several folders lay open. "I want you to consult for my team. Temporary position. Competitive pay." Her instinct told her to run. Every rich man who'd ever offered her temporary work had wanted something else entirely. "What's the catch?" she asked. "There isn't one," Reed said quietly. "Just tell me what my people can't see." For the next hour, they went through the Zurich documents. Camille read, translated, and corrected them faster than his multilingual staff could cross-check one clause. Reed watched in silence, half in awe, half in guilt. She wasn't just fluent. She understood intention, cultural nuance, the invisible politics embedded in every word. When she finally set her pen down, she said, "You don't have a translation problem. You have a trust problem." He raised a brow. "Meaning?" "Your team writes what they think the client wants to hear, not what's true. They adapt meaning to ego." Her words landed harder than he expected. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Reed said softly, "You talk like you've been in boardrooms before." Camille smiled without warmth. "I've been in enough rooms to know when people stop listening." He leaned forward. "I didn't stop." And that was the moment she realized. He hadn't. Not once. When she left that day, snow was falling again. Reed watched her from the window, her small figure pushing a stroller across the white-dusted pavement. Something in his chest ached, a feeling he couldn't label, only recognize. He turned back to his desk where her handwriting still marked his files in red ink. Each correction was neat, exact, and quietly devastating. For the first time in years, Reed Langston understood what it meant to be fluent, and how much truth could hide in the spaces between words. Camille hadn't meant to impress anyone. When Reed Langston had offered her a temporary contract, she'd assumed it was a polite gesture, the kind of guilt-driven favor rich men perform to feel less monstrous. But by the end of her first week, half of his international team was quoting her corrections like scripture. She wasn't loud. She didn't have to be. The moment she opened her mouth, rooms quieted. On Monday, she dissected a German proposal word by word, exposing a clause that subtly shifted intellectual property rights away from Langston Biotech. On Wednesday, she corrected a Japanese partner's phrasing that would have offended an entire government delegation. By Friday, even the most skeptical executives had started waiting for her nod before approving anything. Reed noticed. He watched her work from the corner of every boardroom, calm, focused, fingers moving across documents like she was listening to music only she could hear. He'd built his empire on precision and efficiency, but Camille operated on something deeper, understanding. She didn't just translate words, she translated people. That afternoon, they were preparing for the Zurich Summit, a meeting that would define the next 5 years of Reed's company. Camille stood at the conference table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair escaping her braid as she reviewed a stack of printed agendas. "Mr. Langston, this section here," she said, pointing to a paragraph. "Your Swiss partner uses variant wording, responsibility, but the nuance in German implies moral accountability, not just procedural. They're testing your intent." Reed leaned closer. "You think they're baiting me?" "I think they want to know if you'll take the blame when things go wrong." He smiled faintly. "I usually do." Camille looked up at him. "You don't strike me as someone who lets anyone blame him." Reed's gaze held hers. "You'd be surprised what I allow when it keeps the world moving." She didn't answer, but in that brief silence, something charged filled the air, an understanding neither was ready to name. Later that evening, Reed found himself outside Camille's temporary office. The glass wall was fogged slightly from the heat inside, and through it, he could see her son, Noah, curled up on a chair beside her, drawing on a notepad while she typed. He hesitated before knocking. When she opened the door, she looked startled to see him holding 2 paper cups. I wasn't sure if you drink coffee this late, he said, but I figured anyone saving my company from another PR disaster deserves caffeine. Camille accepted the cup with a small, cautious smile. You really don't need to keep thanking me. I know, he said, but I don't know how to stop. She laughed softly, a sound so light it unsettled him. You're used to being the one people thank, aren't you? Guilty, he admitted. You make it hard to remember why. Camille looked at him then. Really looked. You're not as unreadable as you think, Mr. Langston. No? You hide behind language too. Just a different kind. Contracts, data, schedules. It's your way of staying safe. Reed froze. Few people ever dared to read him aloud like that. I suppose that's what you do for everyone, he said quietly. Translate what they can't admit. Camille shrugged, sipping her coffee. Words reveal us. That's why people are afraid of them. The next morning, the boardroom was a war zone. Reed's European director, Daniel Koenig, was livid. I don't understand why we're letting an outsider, an uncredentialed freelancer, mediate our contracts, Koenig snapped. His accent sharpened the words like glass. This is a billion-dollar negotiation, not a language class. Camille stayed silent. Reed leaned back in his chair. If that outsider hadn't flagged the Zurich inconsistency, you'd be explaining to the press why we just lost our patent rights. Koenig's jaw tightened. She was lucky. No, Reed said evenly. She was right. Camille glanced at him, surprised by his defense, but she didn't speak. Instead, she looked directly at Koenig and said, in flawless German, Wenn Sie sich bedroht fühlen, vielleicht sollten Sie Ihre Arbeit prüfen, nicht meine. If you feel threatened, perhaps you should review your own work, not mine. The silence afterward was palpable. Koenig's face flushed crimson. Reed had to bite back a smirk. He ended the meeting 15 minutes early. As they stepped into the corridor, Reed said quietly, You didn't have to humiliate him. Camille didn't flinch. I didn't. I just spoke his language. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Remind me never to argue with you in English then. She smiled, but it faded quickly. He's not wrong, though. I don't belong here. Reed's expression softened. Camille, you belong exactly where people start listening. She didn't respond right away. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, I've spent years talking to people who never heard me. Maybe this time, I should let them. Reed watched her walk away, her shoulders straight, her presence echoing long after she'd turned the corner. For the first time in his life, he realized that leadership wasn't about control, it was about comprehension. And Camille Doyle, the woman who spoke 7 languages, was teaching him a new one without saying a word. Camille arrived at the Zurich summit expecting to interpret. What she didn't expect was to mediate a war. The Langston Biotech conference suite gleamed with sterile perfection. Glass, chrome, and a view of the snow-laced Alps. Around the table sat 6 executives from 3 countries, each smiling politely while their words slid across one another like blades hidden in silk. Reed Langston stood at the head of the table, his expression calm, but Camille could read the tension in his shoulders. He had built his empire on negotiations like these, but today something felt off. The Swiss partners, led by a silver-haired man named Werner Albrecht, kept using deliberately vague phrasing in their proposals. The French team countered with technical jargon that made cooperation nearly impossible. Camille had been hired to translate, but now she was watching the entire deal unravel. When Albrecht smiled and said, Of course, we will share some of the formula data, she caught the weight on the word some. In German, the phrasing implied limitation, an intentional withholding masked as generosity. Reed nodded, unaware. Excuse me, Camille said suddenly, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Albrecht, just to clarify, you mean partial access to the data, correct? Not full co-development rights? The room froze. Albrecht blinked. That is, our interpretation, yes. Reed's gaze snapped toward Camille, sharp as glass. That's not what we agreed to. She translated precisely, brutally. The French delegates exchanged looks. The air thickened with quiet hostility. Reed leaned forward, his tone steady but low. Then we don't have a partnership. We have a misunderstanding. And just like that, the illusion shattered. After the meeting collapsed, the delegation filed out, murmuring into phones and hurling polite apologies. Reed stayed seated, fingers steepled against his lips. Camille stood by the window, heart pounding. Finally, he said, "You saved me again." She turned. "I just told the truth." "That's the problem," he said, half smiling. "The truth doesn't make friends." Camille exhaled, still tense. "It makes better contracts." Reed laughed softly. "You'd make a terrifying CEO." "I'd make a careful one." He looked at her for a long moment. "You realize you just dismantled 3 months of legal groundwork in one sentence?" "I also saved you from signing away your company's research," she replied evenly. He nodded slowly. "And I'm not sure if I should thank you or be afraid of you." Camille smiled faintly. "Maybe both." That night, Reed found her sitting in the hotel cafe, a cup of tea cooling beside her laptop. She was still awake, still editing documents, her son's photo tucked neatly beside the keyboard. He hesitated before sitting across from her. "You don't sleep, do you?" "Not when something's broken," she said without looking up. "Your partnership with Albrecht, it wasn't supposed to fail. It was supposed to test you." Reed frowned. "Test me how?" "People like him only trust power they can't manipulate. You didn't flinch today. That's how you'll earn respect in Europe." He studied her. "And how do you know that?" Camille closed her laptop and finally met his gaze. "Because I used to work for people like him. Academic elites, professors who smiled while taking credit for everything I wrote. I learned the language of condescension before I learned French." Reed leaned back, surprised by her candor. "Why'd you leave?" She hesitated, then said softly, "Because when I got pregnant, they stopped speaking to me. Turns out motherhood doesn't translate well in academia." The words hung between them, fragile and unguarded. Reed's voice was quiet. "They made a mistake." Camille gave a tired smile. "Mistakes are how people like them survive." The next morning, Zurich woke to sunlight. Reed and Camille stood side by side in the hotel lobby, preparing to head to the airport. But before they could leave, Daniel Koenig approached, flanked by 2 executives. "Langston," he said coolly, "a word." Reed's jaw tightened. "Now?" Koenig's eyes flicked toward Camille. "Yes, now." Reed turned slightly toward her. "Wait for me in the car." She nodded but didn't move far. Through the glass, she could see Koenig's gestures grow sharper, his voice low but furious. At one point, he slammed a folder onto the counter. Reed didn't raise his tone, but his expression hardened, cold and final. When he rejoined her minutes later, his hands were steady but his voice was clipped. "Koenig's taking a leave of absence." Camille raised a brow. "Voluntary?" "Let's say advised." She didn't ask further. Whatever had just happened, she knew it wasn't just about contracts anymore. As they walked to the car, Reed said quietly, "You were right, about trust." She looked at him, puzzled. "People don't earn it with word," he said. "They earn it by what they choose not to hide." Camille held his gaze. "Then maybe it's time you stopped hiding too." Reed didn't answer, but the faintest smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he opened the car door for her. As the plane took off hours later, Reed found himself watching Camille sleep beside the window, Noah's tiny blanket tucked over her shoulder. The Alps shimmered below like shards of glass. He realized something then, something that unsettled him more than any negotiation ever had. He was no longer thinking about how she could help his company. He was thinking about how she was changing him. Reed Langston didn't notice when work stopped feeling like work. It happened quietly, in the spaces between flights and meetings, in the way Camille's voice steadied a room, or the way her laugh, rare but unguarded, made late-night deadlines almost bearable. Somewhere along the way, she had become more than his consultant. She was his compass. And yet, that terrified him. Back in Boston, Langston Biotech was in upheaval. The Zurich fallout had sent shockwaves through the board. Investors were nervous. Competitors smelled weakness. Daniel Koenig's sudden departure only added fuel to rumors. Reed was used to controlling chaos. He'd built empires from it. But this time, something was different. For the first time, his instincts told him not to fight harder, but to listen. Camille stood at the end of the long, mahogany conference table, a pen in hand, her hair pinned up messily as she translated reports. The board members eyed her like an anomaly. Too young, too calm, too uninvited. When one of them muttered, "Why is she even here?" she didn't look up. "Because you hired the wrong translators for 5 years," she said evenly, "and I don't mean linguists." The silence that followed was electric. Reed almost smiled. After the meeting, he found her in the break lounge, refilling her coffee. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Do what?" "Humiliate my board." She turned, arching a brow. "They humiliated themselves. I just provided subtitles." He couldn't stop the laugh that escaped. "You know, most people are terrified of me." Camille met his eyes. "Then most people don't see you." He stilled. No one had ever said that to him before. "Camille," he began, but the word tangled in his throat. Before he could continue, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Her expression faltered for the briefest moment. "Everything okay?" Reed asked. She hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yeah, just daycare billing again. Nothing exciting." But something about her tone felt off. That night, Reed sat in his penthouse, staring out over the city. He told himself not to pry, not to let curiosity become obsession. But that resolve vanished when his mind replayed the exhaustion in her voice. He opened his laptop, scanning through internal HR records. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but what he found wasn't classified. Camille Doyle was still listed as a part-time consultant, paid per project, no benefits, no childcare stipend. It hit him harder than he expected. He shut the laptop, then reopened it, then picked up his phone. Within an hour, he had his finance team on a midnight call. "Effective immediately," he said. "I want a new policy drafted for single-parent contractors. Healthcare, flexible hours, childcare reimbursements, the works." "Sir," his CFO protested, "that'll cost—" "I don't care what it costs," Reed cut in. "It's long overdue." As he hung up, he realized something unexpected. For once, his decisions weren't about profit margins. They were about fairness. And somehow that made him feel richer than he'd been in years. The next morning, Camille walked into her office to find an envelope on her desk. Inside was a memo. Subject: Updated contractor benefits. Effective immediately, all independent specialists will receive comprehensive support under the Langston Parent Flex initiative. Health and childcare coverage. Extended contract terms, education grants for dependents. At the bottom, a single line in Reed's handwriting. "You deserve this. No conditions attached." Camille stared at it for a long time before whispering, "What are you doing?" "Reed Langston." Later that afternoon, she stormed into his office, the memo clutched in her hand. "This," she said, waving it at him, "is not necessary." He looked up from his laptop, calm. It was overdue. "Don't do that," she said, frustration flickering behind her composure. "Don't turn a simple gesture into corporate policy. You can't fix people's lives with a signature." "I didn't do it for you," he said quietly. "I did it because you showed me who I've been ignoring." She froze. "I've built an empire," he continued, "but I didn't build a world. You did that for me, just by showing up." Camille's voice softened. "Reed, I didn't ask for—" "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them thrummed with something unspoken. Not romance yet, but recognition. Finally, she exhaled. "You really are impossible." He smiled faintly. "That's what makes me consistent." That evening, as the city dimmed, Reed watched from his office window as Camille left the building. Noah ran into her arms at the curb, laughing. She kissed his forehead, whispered something, then looked up, unknowingly meeting Reed's gaze across the glass. For one impossible moment, it felt like the world narrowed to just that. A man who'd forgotten how to listen, and a woman who spoke in truths that rewrote him. Reed pressed a hand against the cold window pane. He didn't know what came next, only that for the first time, he wanted to understand more than he wanted to win. And that realization, quiet, humbling, undeniable, scared him more than any deal ever had. Camille woke to the sound of rain tapping the glass outside her apartment window. It was one of those gray Boston mornings that blurred time, and for a rare moment, she allowed herself to linger. Noah still asleep in the next room, the city just beginning to stir. Her life had changed faster than she'd realized. Langston Biotech had gone from being a temporary paycheck to something closer to belonging. Reed had insisted she work remotely part of the week to balance things at home, and for the first time in years, Camille wasn't just surviving. She was building. But stability always came with an echo of fear, the kind that whispered, "Don't get comfortable." By noon, she was at headquarters again. Reed had called for a strategy meeting with the Zurich partners, the same ones who had nearly derailed the deal. Only this time, they were coming to Boston. The boardroom was immaculate as always, but the tension was already simmering. Reed stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, flanked by executives who'd suddenly rediscovered loyalty now that profits had rebounded. Camille sat beside him, notes in hand, ready to interpret but also to listen. Werner Albrecht entered last, smiling like a man who knew how to win without raising his voice. "Mr. Langston," he greeted smoothly, "it's good to see American hospitality is still as punctual as your markets." Reed's tone was cool. "We believe in efficiency," Albrecht chuckled. "Efficiency and redemption, perhaps?" Camille caught it instantly. The word redemption wasn't casual. It implied guilt, weakness. In German business rhetoric, it was a subtle power play. Before Reed could reply, she spoke up, translating with a calm that disguised steel. "Mr. Albrecht says it's good to see your company remains as strong as your integrity." Albrecht blinked, his smirk faltering. Yes," he said carefully. Reed shot her a glance, one that held both surprise and gratitude. She had once again turned confrontation into control. After the meeting, Reed lingered behind as the others filed out. Camille gathered her notes, pretending not to notice his silence. "You didn't translate him," he finally said. "I interpreted his intent," she replied. "There's a difference." Reed leaned against the table, watching her. "You ever worry about the consequences of being right all the time?" She smiled faintly. "I've learned that truth only hurts people who depend on lies." He tilted his head. "And what about people who depend on control?" Camille met his gaze. "Then they'll have to learn a new language." Their eyes held for a moment longer than either expected. It wasn't flirtation. It was recognition, the kind that burned quietly but left marks. That evening, Reed invited her to dinner. Strictly professional, he'd said, though they both knew formality was a fragile pretense by now. They met at a quiet restaurant overlooking the harbor, the kind of place where deals were made and hearts were broken with equal precision. Camille wore simple black, her hair loose for once. Reed, dressed down in a charcoal jacket, looked more human than she'd ever seen him. For a while they talked business, expansion plans, translation models, the possibility of a European division. But slowly the conversation shifted. He asked about Noah. She asked about the years before Langston Biotech. Reed hesitated, then admitted, "My father died when I was 17. He built things too. Factories, small ones. He used to say the hardest part of success is pretending it doesn't change you." Camille listened quietly. "Did it?" Reed's jaw tightened. "It turned me into him, at least until you walked into my flight and corrected me mid-contract." She laughed softly. "That was hardly a revolution." "For me it was," he said, his tone gentle but unflinching. "You reminded me that language isn't a tool, it's a mirror." Camille felt the weight of that sentence settle between them. She wanted to deflect, to turn the conversation away before it grew dangerous. But she didn't. Instead, she asked, "And what do you see now?" Reed's voice dropped. "Someone who stopped hiding behind words." The air between them thickened. Too charged to name, too fragile to touch. Before either could speak again, Camille's phone buzzed. A text from Noah's babysitter. Her expression shifted instantly, worry clouding the warmth in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, standing. "I have to go." Reed rose too. "Is everything all right?" She nodded quickly, already grabbing her coat. "Just a fever. Nothing serious. Thank you for dinner." He watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her. But that night, as rain began again over the city, Reed Langston realized something that unsettled him more than any boardroom coup ever could. He wasn't afraid of losing a deal anymore. He was afraid of losing her. The fever broke at dawn. Camille sat beside Noah's bed, eyes heavy from a night without sleep, one hand resting on his back as he finally breathed evenly again. The cheap thermometer blinked 98.9-degree wheel. Relief came like air after drowning, but it was short-lived. Exhaustion weighed on her bones. Her phone buzzed with unread messages from Reed. Reed, is he all right? Reed, do you need anything? Reed, Camille, please answer. She typed a quick reply. He's fine, I'm fine, don't worry. Then put the phone face down. But she wasn't fine, not really. She'd crossed an invisible line without realizing it. Reed wasn't just her employer anymore. He'd become the one person who looked at her and saw more than what life had taken. And that realization scared her far more than any fever could. By the time she returned to Langston Biotech 2 days later, the office felt different. Conversations paused when she entered. The whispers weren't cruel, not exactly, but they were curious. She'd gone from invisible consultant to the CEO's trusted confidant overnight, and that kind of transformation drew attention, like light drew moths. Reed was waiting in his office when she walked in. You should have stayed home, he said, his tone softer than his words. I'm not sick, she replied. I didn't mean you. That silence, the kind that could fill an entire room, returned between them. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit, please. Camille hesitated but obeyed. He poured her tea instead of coffee. Chamomile, she noticed. He remembered. You didn't answer my calls, he said quietly. I told you. No is better. That's all that matters. It's not all that matters, Reed countered. You matter too. The words slipped out like instinct, not calculation. For a man who measured language like currency, he spent that one freely. Camille blinked, unsure how to respond. Reed, let me finish, he said, leaning forward. I've spent years surrounded by people who only spoke to hear themselves. You're the first person who listens, who translates people into something honest. I don't want that to end. Her throat tightened. You're talking like this is personal. It is personal, he said, and his voice, and usually smooth and certain, trembled just slightly. I don't know when it happened. I just know that when you're not here, I start looking for you in every room. Camille looked away. The city lights shimmered through the glass walls behind him, making everything feel too bright, too exposed. This can't happen, she said finally. Why not? Because you're my boss. Because I have a son. Because this world you live in, she gestured to the skyline, the suits, the power. It doesn't forgive women who forget their place. Reed stood, his expression unreadable. Then maybe it's time we change the language of that world. Her laugh came out sharp, tired. You can't rewrite how people see me? No, he said quietly, but I can choose how I see you. That stopped her cold. He walked to the window, his reflection ghosted in the glass. You think I don't understand the cost of caring? I built everything I have by avoiding it. But now, he turned, meeting her eyes. I don't want to anymore. Camille's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to believe him, desperately, but belief had burned her before. I need to think, she whispered. Then think, he said softly, but don't run. She didn't run, but she didn't return the next day either. Reed didn't call. He didn't email. He just waited. When she finally walked back into his office 3 days later, she found him staring at a document titled Langston Foundation Initiative. He looked up, startled. You came back. I didn't leave, she said. I just needed space. He nodded slowly. And I can't promise you anything, she admitted, but I also can't pretend you haven't changed everything. He smiled. Not the polished one he used in meetings, but the small, human one she'd only seen when he forgot to perform. Good, he said, because I wasn't asking for a promise, just honesty. Camille studied him. The man who had once seemed untouchable, now standing in front of her stripped of every defense. She thought of all the languages she'd learned, all the words she'd mastered, and how none of them could capture the strange, terrifying clarity of that moment. Finally, she said, Then I'll start with the truth. I'm afraid. Reed stepped closer, stopping just short of her. So am I. They stood there in silence, two people fluent in 1,000 words, and yet utterly undone by what they didn't say. Through the glass, the city pulsed beneath them, alive, untranslatable, and waiting. The winter air in Boston carried that quiet heaviness of unspoken things. Camille stood in the Langston Biotech lobby early that morning, watching employees pass through security with brisk, practiced indifference. She'd been back for 2 weeks, and though the days had resumed their rhythm, something between her and Reed had shifted. Not broken, not quite mended. Just suspended. She had told him she was afraid. He hadn't tried to change her mind. And yet every meeting, every glance across the boardroom, every brief email carried the same unspoken truth. Neither of them could go back to before. Reed arrived late that morning, uncharacteristically. He looked tired, though not from lack of sleep. There was something heavier in his posture, like he'd spent the night negotiating with ghosts. "Zurich called," he said as he entered her office. "They're proposing a new deal." Camille looked up from her notes. "You're not taking it," he arched an eyebrow. "How do you know?" "Because you hate repetition, and because you've already learned their language. They can't manipulate you twice." He smiled faintly, almost reluctantly. "You're right, again." "Occupational hazard," she said softly. But then he added, "This time they want you on the call." Camille froze. "Me? They specifically requested you. Apparently your reputation precedes you." Her throat went dry. "Or maybe they just want to test me." Reed leaned against the doorframe. "Let them. You've been tested your whole life." The words landed deeper than he intended. He saw it in the flicker of her expression. A flash of something raw, almost offensive. The call began at noon sharp. The Zurich delegates spoke in their usual diplomatic rhythm, all courtesy layered over calculation. Camille responded in measured French, translating Reed's concise English replies into something more fluid, elegant, the kind of language that carried precision and empathy in equal measure. Halfway through, the lead negotiator attempted to slide in a restructured clause, one that would subtly reduce Langston Biotech's control over its own patents. Camille didn't interrupt. She simply raised a hand, smiled, and switched to German. Her voice changed, lower, sharper, every syllable deliberate. "You're trying to modify intellectual ownership without authorization," she said evenly. "Do you think we wouldn't notice because the phrasing is softer?" A silence followed. One of the men coughed. Another muttered something under his breath that Reed didn't catch. But Camille did, and replied to instantly, dismantling his argument in his own tongue. When the call ended, Reed said quietly, "That was brutal." Camille removed her earpiece, setting it gently on the table. "It was honest." He smiled. "You're redefining that word for me." She gave a small shrug. "Honesty doesn't mean kindness. It means clarity." Reed looked at her for a long moment. "Then let's be clear." Camille met his gaze. He continued, "I don't want this to stay unspoken." Her pulse quickened. "Reed." "I've tried to stay professional," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've told myself to respect boundaries, to wait until it makes sense. But it never will. Because nothing about this, about you, makes sense, and I don't care anymore." She stared at him, heart pounding. "You think saying it out loud will make it easier?" "No," he said. "It'll make it real." Camille stood, every instinct screaming at her to leave before she lost control. But instead of walking away, she found herself whispering, "You don't know what you're asking for." Reed took a step closer. "I know exactly what I'm asking for. You, Camille." The sound of her name in his voice almost undid her. "You don't understand," she said, her tone breaking for the first time. "You get to walk away from mistakes. I don't. If I fall, I don't just lose a job. I lose everything I've built for Noah." Reed's expression softened. "Then I'll make sure you don't fall. That's not how the world works." "Then we'll change the world, Minor," he said simply. Camille let out a shaky laugh. "You really think you can rewrite everything, don't you?" "I already started," Reed replied, his gaze unwavering. "The first day you corrected me on that flight." Her resistance cracked, if only for a second. Then quietly she said, "You shouldn't say these things if you don't mean them." "I mean every word," he said, and for once she believed him. Later, when she walked out of the office, the snow had started again, soft flakes spinning through the city lights. She pulled her coat tight around her and exhaled a long, trembling breath. Her phone buzzed. A message from Reed. No business tomorrow. Come with me instead. There's a conference in Geneva. I'll need a translator. Camille smiled despite herself. She typed back, professional translator only, and hit send. Then after a pause, she added, but I'll go. The cold air bit her cheeks, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel the chill. Something inside her had shifted, fragile, terrifying, but alive. And though she didn't know what Geneva would bring, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Reed Langston had stopped being the language she worked in. He had become the one she understood. The wind off Lake Geneva carried a kind of silence that felt deliberate, as if the world itself was listening. Camille stood on the hotel balcony, the city spread before her in shades of silver and glass. Below, morning light touched the rooftops, softening their edges. The air was crisp, almost too still, and she found herself tracing the condensation on her coffee cup, pretending her thoughts weren't already miles away. Behind her, the door opened. You're awake early, Reed said. His voice was rough from sleep, quieter than usual, as if he knew words could break the peace. I couldn't, she admitted. My mind's too loud. He leaned on the railing beside her. That's what happens when you start caring about things that matter. She smiled faintly. You talk like someone who hasn't cared in a long time. Reed looked out toward the lake. Until you. The words lingered in the air, heavier than the morning fog. Camille didn't respond right away. Instead, she said softly, there's a difference between needing someone and understanding them. I know, he said. You're the first person who's made me understand the difference. The day's negotiations began at 9 sharp in a high-rise overlooking the water. The room was all glass and marble, filled with men who treated words like weapons and women like punctuation. Camille translated flawlessly, her tone smooth, her posture unshakable. But inside, she was tense. Something about this meeting felt wrong. Halfway through the session, she noticed a quiet exchange between 2 delegates at the far end of the table. Their German was fast, coded, but she caught fragments. Change the clause. Proprietary data. They won't notice. Her pulse quickened. She interrupted before the senior translator could speak. Excuse me, she said in perfect German, voice steady but cold. Would you mind clarifying that last statement? You mentioned modifying the intellectual property clause. That wasn't part of our previous agreement. The room stilled. The delegate blinked, surprised she'd caught it. You must have misheard. Reed leaned forward, his tone controlled but deadly. She doesn't mishear. Camille's fingers tightened around her pen. You were attempting to change ownership rights for the biosynthetic compounds, she said. That would give your firm full control over the licensing. I suggest we stop pretending this is a misunderstanding. The man flushed. Reed turned to his legal team. End the session. Within minutes, the conference room emptied, leaving only the 2 of them. Reed ran a hand through his hair, pacing by the window. They tried to steal us blind. And they thought I wouldn't notice, Camille said quietly. He turned to her, his expression softening. You just saved my company. Again. She shook her head. No, I just listened. Exactly, he said. That's what no one else ever does. That night, they skipped the corporate dinner. Reed drove them out of the city, following the lakeside road until the skyline disappeared behind the trees. They stopped near a small cafe that overlooked the water. Closed for the season, empty but for its terrace and string lights flickering weakly in the cold. The air smelled of snow. Reed leaned against the railing, watching her. You could do anything, Camille. You know that, right? I'm doing what I can, she said simply. You could run your own firm. You could teach. You could change the way the world hears itself. She smiled faintly. You talk like a man who wants me to leave. He turned toward her, startled. No, I talk like someone who knows you'll outgrow me. She looked away. You think too far ahead. Sometimes all we have is now. Then let's make it enough, he said. She hesitated, then stepped closer. The distance between them vanished like breath in the cold. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. There was no grand declaration, no orchestrated romance. Just 2 people standing on the edge of something fragile, knowing it couldn't last forever but daring to hold it anyway. Later, as they drove back through the quiet streets, Camille rested her head against the window, watching reflections blur. "Why did you really bring me here?" she asked. Reed kept his eyes on the road. "Because I needed you beside me when I stopped being the man I used to be." "And who's that?" He smiled sadly. "Someone who thought winning was the only language worth learning." Camille turned to him. "And now? Now I'm trying to speak yours." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached across the console, her hand brushing his. A small gesture, but one that carried more truth than anything they'd said that day. When they reached the hotel, Reed walked her to her room. Neither wanted to say goodnight. The world outside had gone still again, snow falling softly in the streetlights. As she turned to unlock her door, he said quietly, "Camille?" She looked back. "If I asked you to stay, not for business, not for me, but for us, what would you say?" Camille held his gaze. "I'd say I don't know yet." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer all along. "Then I'll wait." She smiled, weary but real. "You're not very patient." "For you," he said, "I can learn." And as the door closed between them, Reed realized something astonishing. For the first time in his life, waiting didn't feel like losing. The last morning in Geneva came quietly, wrapped in fog and the soft hum of distant bells. Camille watched from the balcony as the lake rippled in pale silver light. Below, the city was just waking, delivery trucks idling at intersections, cafes opening their shutters, steam rising from chimneys. Everything felt fragile, as if the world was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Inside, Noah sat on the bed with his coloring book, humming to himself. His crayons rolled across the blanket, scattering reds and blues like confetti. Camille smiled faintly, brushing a hand over his hair. "Almost ready to go home, sweetheart." He nodded without looking up. "Will Mr. Reed come too?" Her hand froze. "No, honey. He's got work to finish here." Noah frowned. "But he likes us." Camille looked out toward the fog again, swallowing the ache in her chest. "Yes," she said softly. "He does." Downstairs, Reed was already in the lobby, his suitcase beside him. He looked like someone who hadn't slept, eyes shadowed, jaw tight, but posture steady. The moment he saw Camille and Noah step out of the elevator, something softened in him. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," she replied. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. The silence between them was heavy with everything they hadn't said. Reed bent slightly toward Noah. "You take care of your mom for me, okay?" Noah grinned. "I already do." That made Reed laugh, the kind of laugh that cracked through the tension and reminded Camille why she let him in at all. When Noah skipped ahead toward the taxi stand, Reed's voice lowered. "You're really going back?" "I have to," she said. Us, it can't survive in hotel rooms and airports." Reed nodded slowly. "I know." He hesitated, then added, "But I also know I can't go back to who I was before you." Camille's eyes stung. "Reed, don't," he said gently. "Don't apologize for saving me." She shook her head. "You didn't need saving." He smiled faintly. "Everyone does, Camille. Even people who build worlds." The flight home was quiet. Noah slept against her shoulder, and for hours Camille stared out the window at clouds stitched together by sunlight. Her reflection in the glass looked older somehow, not from time, but from truth. She thought of Reed, the man who'd once spoken in numbers and clauses, now learning how to speak in silences. The man who'd taught her that power didn't have to mean cruelty. But more than that, she thought of herself. For years, she'd believed her story ended the day she became a single mother, that her life had narrowed into practicality, translation jobs, and invisible strength. But Reed had changed that, not by rescuing her, but by seeing her. And now she understood something she never had before. She didn't need to choose between survival and meaning. She could have both. 2 months later, Boston bloomed into spring. Camille's small office smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. The sign on the door read, "Doyle Linguistic Consulting, where words become bridges." She had clients now, a few from Reed's network, others from universities and nonprofits. Her schedule was full, but her days were hers. Noah's laughter drifted from the next room, where he played with a toy Reed had sent, a small wooden plane with his initials carved on the wing. Camille smiled, shaking her head. Of course he'd send something that flew. Her phone buzzed. A message from Reed. Zurich approved the ethics charter you wrote. We're launching the new initiative under your name. I'm proud of you. She read it twice, then typed back. It was never just mine, Reed. It was ours. Then after a pause, thank you for listening. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the harbor, a knock sounded on her office door. Camille looked up, startled, and froze. Reed stood there, wind in his hair, a half-smile tugging at his lips. I was in the neighborhood, he said. She laughed softly. You're 6,000 miles from your neighborhood. Geneva got quieter, he said. I didn't like it. Her heart thudded painfully. You shouldn't have come. I had to, he said simply. There's one more translation I need your help with. She crossed her arms, trying to hide her shaking hands. Oh? And what language is that? He stepped closer. The kind that doesn't use words. For a long moment, neither moved. The light between them dimmed, soft and amber. Then Camille whispered, You still don't know how to make anything simple, do you? Reed smiled. Only meaningful. They didn't rush toward each other. There was no cinematic kiss, no sudden music swelling in the background, just a slow, careful reaching out. A touch of hands, the quiet understanding that sometimes love wasn't a rescue, but a recognition. The city hummed around them, alive with 1,000 languages, none of them enough to describe what passed between two people who had already learned to listen beyond words. Camille's voice broke the silence first. So what now? Reed looked at her, eyes steady. Now we build something that lasts, together. And for the first time in years, Camille didn't doubt the meaning behind the promise. She didn't need a translator for that. That night, as she walked home with Noah's hand in hers and Reed at her side, the world felt different. Not perfect, not certain, but wide open. The sky above Boston glowed with city light, and Camille thought, this is what it means to arrive. Not at the end of a journey, but at the beginning of one where you finally understand your own voice.